What if a war shaking the world didn't end with a treaty? But with a few sudden posts online. After 40 days of intense conflict, United States, Iran, and regional powers. A fragile ceasefire emerged. Not in a grand hall, but through rapid digital announcements. Left the world both relieved and uncertain. We uncover how this war escalated so quickly. What really forced both sides to step back. Hidden demands shaping this uneasy truce. High-stakes negotiations behind the scenes. Now, let's step into the moment everything suddenly changed. The moment arrived like the sudden dimming of a battlefield sky. After more than a month of widening war, threats of catastrophic escalation, and a region pushed to the brink by attacks on cities, oil infrastructure, shipping lanes, and regional allies, the first signal of a halt did not come from a formal treaty hall or a United Nations chamber. It came through social media and official statements. According to CNN, U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Truth Social that the United States would suspend strikes on Iran for 2 weeks, on the condition that Iran immediately and safely reopen the Strait of Hormuz. BBC reported that Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif then declared the ceasefire effective immediately, while Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said Tehran would halt what it described as defensive operations if attacks on Iran stopped. In other words, the world learned of a possible pause in war through a chain of rapidly issued digital declarations, each carrying a different tone but pointing toward the same fragile fact. For the moment, both sides were stepping back. But even in the first hours, the ceasefire was less a clean line than a blurred edge. CNN reported that Iran's Supreme National Security Council framed the arrangement not as a concession, but as an enduring defeat for Washington, and said Tehran had compelled the United States to use Iran's 10-point proposal as a basis for further talks. Writers, however, noted that Washington and Tehran were still far apart, especially over uranium enrichment, missile limits, sanctions relief, and the status of Iran's regional allies. Israel backed the pause in strikes on Iran, but said the deal did not include Lebanon, directly contradicting Pakistan's broader description of the arrangement. That contradiction mattered immediately, because it meant that while one battlefield was supposed to quiet, another could continue burning. The ceasefire was real in the sense that both Washington and Tehran publicly acknowledged it, but from the very first hour, its boundaries were contested. Reuters, CNN. And so the announcement landed not as peace, but as suspension. Al Jazeera analysis suggests the deal was best understood as a temporary mechanism to stop immediate escalation and open a narrow diplomatic corridor, not as a finalized peace agreement. Fox News highlighted that within hours of the announcement, Gulf states were already reporting new interceptions of drones and missiles, while the White House described the arrangement as a fragile truce. Some details that circulated in the first wave of reporting, including proposals that Iran and Oman might charge fees for ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, were reported by Iranian-linked outlets and cited by CNN, but CNN also said it sought comment from Oman. This information could not be independently confirmed. In documentary terms, the breaking moment was dramatic, but its core message was more restrained. The guns were not silent, because trust had been built. They were quiet, temporarily, because further war had become too dangerous to continue that night. To understand the ceasefire, it is necessary to understand its duration. Reuters reported that the attacks which triggered this direct phase of war began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran. By the time the ceasefire was announced late on April 7th and took effect on April 8th, the conflict had run roughly 40 days. Al Jazeera explicitly described the deal as halting 40 days of U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran. BBC referred to it as a 40-day war, while the Associated Press described the conflict as entering its sixth week. CNN, meanwhile, called it a month and a half of spiraling conflict. Different outlets use different clocks, but the timeline converges on the same conclusion. This was not a one-night exchange or a symbolic flare-up. It was a sustained regional war, measured in weeks, not hours. Those 40 days were dense with escalation. CNN reported that within days of the initial strikes, new fronts had opened across the region, with Lebanon pulled deeper into combat, Gulf states facing missile and drone threats, and the Strait of Hormuz effectively shuttered by danger and coercion. BBC reported that the US and Israel described their early strikes as preemptive measures against Iranian threats, while Tehran presented the campaign as an assault on its sovereignty carried out during ongoing diplomatic maneuvering. The war was short compared with the decades-long US-Iran rivalry, but unusually direct. Reuters and AP both stressed that what had long been fought through proxies, sanctions, covert attacks, and deterrence signals had broken into open confrontation involving the United States, Iran, Israel, and a wider regional fallout. There was also a historical echo inside the duration itself. BBC noted that this war followed a previous 12-day war in June 2025, when US and Israeli strikes also targeted Iranian nuclear and military facilities. So while the 2026 war lasted about 40 days, it was part of a broader sequence of escalating confrontations rather than a wholly isolated event. That is what made the ceasefire significant. It ended the most intense direct phase of fighting so far, but it did not erase the pattern that led there. In that sense, the duration of the conflict was measured two ways at once: 40 days on the battlefield and decades in the political memory of the region. The roots of this ceasefire stretch back far beyond 2026. BBC's long-running history of US-Iran relations traces the hostility to the 1953 CIA-backed coup against Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, an event that left a deep scar in Iranian political memory. Reuters similarly reported that Iran and the United States had once been partners, but that alliance collapsed after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when revolutionary leaders cast America as the Great Satan, and the U.S. embassy hostage crisis destroyed what remained of the old strategic relationship. Those were not just historical milestones. They became the architecture of mutual suspicion. Every sanction, every naval confrontation, every covert operation, and every round of nuclear diplomacy since then has unfolded inside that inherited structure of grievance and distrust. Then came the nuclear issue, which transformed old hostility into a permanent strategic crisis. BBC reported that in the 2000s, revelations about Iranian nuclear facilities led to waves of sanctions by the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union. Writers wrote that Iran insisted its enrichment program was civilian and legal, while Washington and its allies believed Tehran had concealed essential elements of its program and feared it was seeking a weapon capability. The 2015 nuclear deal temporarily narrowed that gap by limiting Iran's nuclear activity in exchange for sanctions relief. But BBC noted that President Trump withdrew from the deal in 2018, restoring sanctions and deepening confrontation. From that point forward, the nuclear file was no longer just a technical dispute about centrifuges and uranium stockpiles. It became a symbol of whether either side believed the other could be constrained at all. The regional dimension made everything more combustible. Writers reported that Iran's rivalry with the United States has often played out through partners and armed groups across the Middle East, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite factions in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas. The United States, by contrast, remained Israel's main backer and a security partner to Gulf Arab monarchies that viewed Tehran as a threat. CNN emphasized that once the 2026 war began, these long-standing alignments converted almost immediately into multiple active fronts. What had been a system of indirect competition now became an interconnected military crisis. The Strait of Hormuz, through which about a fifth of global oil shipments passed before the war, became both a military choke point and a bargaining chip, turning regional conflict into a global economic emergency. Reuters, CNN. The immediate trigger, according to public US and Israeli statements cited by BBC and CNN, was the claim that Iran posed an imminent military and nuclear threat. Israeli officials called the first strikes preemptive. US officials also used preemptive language, saying America had to act in the face of expected Iranian attacks on US forces. But CNN reported that Pentagon briefers acknowledged Tehran was not planning to attack US forces or bases unless Israel attacked first. That contradiction is central. It does not erase the threat perceptions that drove policy in Washington and Jerusalem, but it does show that the public case for war was disputed even within the American system. On the Iranian side, Al Jazeera reported that Tehran rejected early U.S. ceasefire demands as maximalist and unreasonable, and insisted the United States had attacked Iran during high-level diplomacy before. That is why the ceasefire of April 2026 cannot be explained as a sudden breakthrough. It emerged from a crisis rooted in revolution, sanctions, nuclear mistrust, proxy warfare, and competing claims of self-defense. When the ceasefire came, Washington's first public condition was unmistakable. According to CNN and BBC, Trump said the United States would suspend bombing Iran for 2 weeks only if Tehran agreed to the complete, immediate, and safe reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. That demand was not symbolic. The strait is one of the world's most important maritime choke points, and Reuters noted that around 1/5 of global oil shipments moved through it before the war. Reopening Hormuz was therefore both a military and economic demand. Stop threatening global commerce, stop holding energy markets hostage, and signal that Iran would not use maritime disruption as leverage during the truce. This was the red line Trump chose to announce publicly and repeatedly. CNN, BBC News, Reuters. Beyond Hormuz, the American position was broader and harder. Reuters reported that Washington's earlier 15-point proposal called for the removal of Iran's highly enriched uranium, a halt to enrichment, curbs on its ballistic missile program, and an end to support for regional allies and proxy groups. CNN reported that the unpublished U.S. plan was believed to include no nuclear weapons, handover of highly enriched uranium, limits on defense capabilities, an end to regional proxy activity, and reopening the strait. Fox News highlighted that Trump publicly insisted there would be no enrichment of uranium and said Iran had agreed to let the United States dig up and remove enriched material from a site hit in an earlier operation. BBC reported that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said U.S. forces would remain ready and could restart military action at a moment's notice if Iran failed to comply. In plain terms, America's demands were not just about pausing fire. They were about reshaping Iran's strategic posture. Highlighted that Trump described Iran's proposal as a workable basis for talks, but later insisted the meaningful points would be discussed behind closed doors. CNN reported that White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt said Iran's public 10-point plan was not the operative text and that the president's red line on enrichment had not changed. That distinction matters because it shows Washington trying to preserve flexibility while avoiding the appearance of concession. According to CNN, critics on the American right feared Trump was willing to give Iran too much, especially if Tehran retained leverage over the strait or preserved any enrichment capacity. So America's ceasefire demands were clear in principle but murky in detail. Reopen Hormuz, accept deeper limits on nuclear and missile capabilities, reduce regional military reach, and move quickly toward a broader settlement. Or face renewed force. Iran's demands were equally expansive, and in some areas, directly incompatible with Washington's. According to Reuters, Iran's Supreme National Security Council said the United States had, in principle, committed to non-aggression, continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz, acceptance of enrichment, lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions, termination of UN Security Council and IAEA Board of Governors resolutions, withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the region, and cessation of war on all fronts, including Lebanon. Fox News highlighted the public Iranian plan as demanding an end to sanctions, full control over the strait, release of frozen Iranian assets, compensation for war damage, and acceptance of Iran's right to enrich uranium, in exchange for Iran pledging not to build nuclear weapons. If America's vision was disarmament with access, Iran's vision was sovereignty with relief. Reuters, Fox News. But Iran's public posture shifted over time. Al Jazeera reported that before the ceasefire, Tehran had rejected earlier U.S. proposals as maximalist and said it wanted a permanent end to the war, reparations, guarantees against future attacks, and recognition of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. BBC later reported that Iran's 10-point plan also included a statement that Iran fully commits to not seeking possession of any nuclear weapons, along with demands for sanctions relief, access to frozen funds, compensation for reconstruction, and a cessation of war in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. The variations between public descriptions of the Iranian terms were significant enough that the White House said the published Iranian text differed from the plan under actual discussion. This information could not be independently confirmed in full. What can be confirmed is that Iran sought not only a halt to bombing, but political recognition, economic relief, and guarantees strong enough to keep the war from restarting on terms dictated by Washington or Jerusalem. Al Jazeera BBC News. Iran also had red lines that were political, not just technical. BBC reported that hardliners in Tehran had opposed even a temporary ceasefire and viewed reopening the strait as a painful retreat after public rhetoric that it would remain closed. Al Jazeera analysis suggests Iran conceded on at least 3 points. It accepted a 2-week ceasefire instead of the permanent halt it had demanded, entered a path toward direct talks with the United States after long resisting that idea, and appeared willing to rely on transit fees and reconstruction formulas rather than immediate direct reparations. Yet Tehran still drew lines around sovereignty, enrichment, and the regional war's broader geography. The sharpest unresolved dispute concerned Lebanon. Pakistan said the ceasefire applied there too. Israel said it did not. Iran warned that if strikes on Lebanon continued, the United States would have to choose between ceasefire and continued war through Israel. That dispute was not a footnote. It was one of the pressure points most likely to break the truce. If the ceasefire looked sudden in public, Reuters made clear that it was the product of intense, improvised, and at times nearly collapsing diplomacy. Pakistan was the central mediator. Reuters reported that Islamabad had exchanged frameworks with Washington and Tehran, served as the principal communication channel, and helped shape a 2-tier formula. Immediate ceasefire first, broader agreement second. Pakistan's role was not ceremonial. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir were in direct contact with Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and senior Iranian security figures. CNN also reported that Pakistan's Prime Minister and military chief were credited by Trump for mediating the pause. The battlefield may have been in Iran, Lebanon, Israel, and the Gulf, but the diplomatic center of gravity shifted decisively to Islamabad. Reuters CNN. The negotiations were not linear. Reuters reported that the talks were almost dead after an Iranian strike on a Saudi petrochemical facility enraged Riyadh and threatened to collapse the mediation effort. Pakistan, which has defense ties with Saudi Arabia but also working relations with Iran, conveyed what Reuters called its strongest ever anger to Tehran while simultaneously pressing Washington for assurances that Israel would hold back further strikes on Iran. Only after Pakistani mediators believed they had enough restraint from the American and Israeli side were they able to persuade Iran to accept a temporary ceasefire without preconditions and enter negotiations. That phrase, without preconditions, is crucial because Reuters also reported that convincing Iran to take that step was the hardest part of the process. It suggests the ceasefire did not emerge from trust-building success, but from the last workable arrangement before the region slid into something even larger. Reuters? Other mediators hovered around the edges. Al Jazeera reported that China helped bring Iran to the table, while Turkey and Egypt had also been passing messages in recent days. BBC reported that Pakistan invited U.S. and Iranian delegations to meet in Islamabad on Friday, and the White House later said Vance, Witkoff, and Jared Kushner would attend. Iranian officials, according to BBC and Reuters, were expected to include Araghchi and senior political figures. The United Nations was not identified by Reuters, BBC, CNN, or Al Jazeera as the primary broker of the ceasefire itself. But the UN remained embedded in the structure of the negotiations. Iran's public framework called for a binding UN resolution to secure any final peace arrangement, and Reuters reported that IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi said the agency stood ready to support diplomacy through safeguards and verification on the nuclear file. So behind the scenes, the architecture was multi-layered. Pakistan as principal mediator, China, Turkey, and Egypt as supportive channels, and the UN system waiting at the far end of the tunnel, where a ceasefire might someday become enforceable agreement. The global reaction was immediate, and it was shaped by relief more than celebration. Reuters reported that UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres welcomed the two-week ceasefire and called on all parties to comply with international law and the terms of the truce in order to pave the way for a lasting peace. IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi welcomed a return to diplomacy and said the agency was ready to support a negotiated settlement on Iran's nuclear program. Britain's Keir Starmer, Germany's Johann Wadephul, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and India's Foreign Ministry all issued statements welcoming the de-escalation and stressing the need to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. This was the language of the international system when catastrophe eases but does not end. Welcome the pause, urge compliance, warn against complacency. Reuters. Al Jazeera's roundup broadened that picture. According to Al Jazeera, China welcomed the ceasefire and emphasized its own diplomatic efforts. Russia said aggressive war had suffered a defeat. France called the ceasefire a very good thing, but explicitly hoped it would include Lebanon. And countries from Australia to Japan to New Zealand urged both sides to turn a temporary halt into something durable. Netanyahu, meanwhile, welcomed Trump's decision but insisted the deal did not apply to Lebanon. That single caveat hung over many of the international reactions, because world leaders were not responding only to the US-Iran ceasefire itself. They were responding to the possibility that one theater of war might pause while another continued to rage. Al Jazeera. The media narratives reflected that same split between hope and skepticism. BBC reported that much remained unclear, especially because Washington and Tehran seemed to hold contradictory understandings of what the ceasefire actually required. Fox News highlighted reported drone and missile interceptions in Gulf states within hours of the truce and called attention to the strain already showing in the arrangement. Al Jazeera analysis suggests both sides were claiming victory while postponing, not resolving, the biggest disputes. CNN reported that even inside Trump's political camp, Iran hawks were alarmed that Washington might concede too much on enrichment or on Iran's leverage over Hormuz. So the global reaction was not a simple chorus. It was a layered response. Governments welcomed the pause, institutions urged legal compliance, journalists flagged contradictions, and analysts warned that everyone might be mistaking an intermission for an ending. What comes next depends on whether this two-week pause can survive its own contradictions. Reuters reported that the public positions of Washington and Tehran still show little overlap, especially on enrichment, sanctions, missile limits, proxy forces, and the future of U.S. military presence in the region. BBC reported that direct talks in Islamabad are expected to push toward a conclusive agreement, while CNN noted that the next 2 weeks are intended to draft final terms. That means the ceasefire is not the end of negotiation. It is the start of the hardest phase, when public slogans have to be translated into precise commitments. If the talks succeed, the result could be a broader settlement linking sanctions relief, nuclear restrictions, freedom of navigation, and mutual non-aggression. If they fail, the ceasefire may simply mark the line from which the war resumes. Reuters, BBC News, CNN. The risks are already visible. Al Jazeera identified 3 major threats: ambiguity over Lebanon, continuing ceasefire violations or near violations in the region, and the fact that Washington and Tehran remain poles apart on core issues. Fox News highlighted the White House's own admission that this is a fragile truce. Reuters reported that Israeli officials opposed a deal they believed might leave military objectives unfinished, while BBC documented hardliner anger inside Iran over reopening Hormuz and entering direct talks with the United States. In other words, both governments are negotiating under pressure from factions that distrust negotiation itself. That is often when ceasefires fail, not because diplomacy is absent, but because it is politically vulnerable. Still, the implications are enormous. If this pause holds, even temporarily, it may prevent a wider regional war and reduce the immediate threat to global energy markets. It may reopen a path for nuclear verification and formal diplomacy after years of failed trust. But the most honest conclusion is the one suggested by the reporting itself. This ceasefire is not yet proof of reconciliation. It is proof that both sides, after 40 days of war and decades of enmity, recognize the cost of continuing at full speed. According to CNN, Trump called it victory. BBC reported that Iran's leadership also portrayed it as victory. Al Jazeera analysis suggests both may be overstating what they gained. The more sober reading is that the ceasefire buys time. Time for negotiators in Islamabad. Time for world powers to apply pressure. Time for civilians to breathe. And time for the next decision. Whether that decision becomes durable peace or renewed war is, at this stage, still unresolved. Where the facts remain disputed, this information could not be independently confirmed beyond the public claims and reporting cited above.